Hi there. Today we're talking about another book in our music series, and it's Twist and Shout by Spencer Leigh. Merseybeat, The Cavern, The Star Club, and The Beatles. Now, Spencer Leigh, I've reviewed several of his books already, and he is the chronicler of Merseybeat. And most of his books, or some of his books anyway, are based on the extensive interviews he's been giving on Radio Merseyside over many years with various entertainment celebrities, and he then pulls quotes from them and constructs a narrative. And it makes a very interesting and also very personal read on the subject. So, Twist and Shout is an expansion on an earlier book that he wrote, and it's been updated and it's fairly thick. There's a foreword by Ron Ellis, who was very much involved in the Merseyside scene as a promoter and a venue manager and so on. And he really sets the scene. To understand Merseybeat, it is necessary to survey the popular music scene at the end of the 50s. Distorted by the rosy glow of nostalgia, the 50s seems to have been an idyllic time to be a teenager in Britain. Pleasures were simple, life was carefree, there was no crime and vandalism like we have today, and one avuncular Prime Minister, Mr. Macmillan, told us we'd never had it so good. All lies. Life had actually been far more exciting in the 20s, in the age of jazz, flappers and ragtime, a social scene that became known as the Roaring Twenties. The proliferation of dance combos formed to cater for the demand for jazz music for the first generation of gramophone records mirrored the situation in the 60s when the beat group boom exploded. By contrast, the 50s were dull. After the war, there was poverty and uniformity, as Britain bore the cost of rebuilding its cities. Bomb sites were everywhere. Food was rationed and there was little choice in the shops. Cars were black and money was tight. The transition from childhood to adulthood was instantaneous. Children wore the same clothes as their parents and often followed the same hobbies. The Second World War was a great dividing line. Boys of 18 were called away to do national service. When they returned, they were men and expected to forget the pastimes of their adolescent years. They got a job, found a nice girl, and settled down. Not a recipe for excitement. Even the music was stale. The big bands of the 30s had given away to smaller units, partly because of economics. Alas, with the improvement of microphone technology, the band's vocalists had assumed greater importance, leading to the cult of the crooners. And he does go on. It was the 50s was a time of austerity, and he mentions the war that went right through for decades. When Gary Spires came to Liverpool, he came on the train, and one of the first things he said to us when we first met him was he thought the war was still on because there were so many bomb sites. There was just missing buildings and gaps and heaps of rubble as you came into Liverpool. So among the quotes you have Johnny Gustafson, known as Johnny Gus, who was a member of the Big Three, and he took up the bass, and he didn't want to haul an upright bass round, so his bandmate Adrian Barber, who was really well noted for tinkering with instruments and amplifiers, modified a standard guitar by widening the grooves at the nut and putting bass strings on it, and lo and behold, Johnny Gus became a bass player. And he actually became an excellent bass player later on. After Merseybeat, he was in demand as a session player, and also played with Roxy Music. There's quite a bit about Hamburg, interviews with the guys who went over there. Brian Griffiths, known as Griff, who was the guitarist in the Big Three when Johnny Gus was playing bass. But before that, he'd been backing Derry Wilkie in the Seniors, who were the first Merseybeat band on the scene in Hamburg. And he recalls him and John Lennon were in the street near the Reaper Barn, and somebody dumped a wheelbarrow of old clothes, rags really, they were throwing out, and they dressed up in these rags and went strutting around St. Pauli, much to the befuddlement of the Germans. So I've mentioned this many times, but when the Beatles came back from Hamburg, they made a big impression at the Litherland Town Hall. And one of the chaps who comments about this era was Peter Cook, who played in a band called the Top Spots, now forgotten. And I'll quote him: "In the early days, I played with the Beatles virtually every week at the Grosvenor Ballroom in Wallasey." He meant he supported the Beatles or played alongside them, I think. "Paul was on rhythm then, and he used to have a Lucky 7 guitar." This was the guitar that disintegrated in Hamburg later. "They were a very, very average band, and I used to think they were that we were far better. Paul did have a brilliant voice for singing Good Golly Miss Molly, but they were nothing special. They went away to Germany, and then there was a buzz going round, 'Have you heard the Beatles?' And I poo-pooed it. We then played Latham Hall, and the Beatles were on, and I was with my arms folded on the dance floor thinking, 'Let's see how good you are.' And the curtains opened, and they started off with Lucille, and they were so tight and so good that every hair on my neck stood up. It was a completely new sound that I had never heard anything like it. I know now that they had the drums mic'd up and they had a mic in the bass drum, so I know what the secret was. I was in awe of them." So really that was the impression that they made when they came back from Hamburg. So although Hamburg has been portrayed as being very, very significant, it was more significant for the Beatles than for the other bands, because of the transformation, and they came back a completely different band. Most of the other bands went to Hamburg already having reached their full potential, and they came back really with very little improvement. Another section of the book deals with recording, and there was a recording studio in Crosby which was called Lambda. Lambda Records, record shop, had the facility to record, and some of the local bands, I think King Size Taylor, had some of his numbers recorded there, just to be able to take and give to promoters and things like that. But the original studio was run by a chap called Percy Phillips in Kensington area of Liverpool, and he recorded the Quarrymen, their first ever attempt at making a record was at Percy Phillips. You paid a few shillings and he generated a disc for you. Ken Dodd used to pay him to record his radio shows. He took them off the radio and put them onto disc for Ken Dodd, so he had a lasting record of them. Then as the Beatles took off and the companies in London saw the opportunity, some of them came up. Oriole Records came up, and they set up a studio at the Rialto Ballroom, which was later destroyed in the Toxteth riots, and they recorded an album called This Is Merseybeat with several bands on it. And so there really was a tremendous interest, and I think some other labels came up and recorded in the Iron Door Club, possibly, and things like this. There was later on, the Cavern actually did have its own record label, and that they used to have a studio as well, which I think was one of the contributions to its eventual downfall. The economics didn't quite work. The boom had passed. Anyway, the book is chock full of facts, observations, and opinions, and it's a fascinating read. Spencer Leigh always produces the goods, and again, anyone interested in the history of those times, the very important times in the career of the Beatles, the Searchers, Jerry and Pacemakers, and so on, will find this book invaluable.